Hello, everyone. Welcome today to our session about identity-first cloud infrastructure security. And I should not walk in front of the screen, right? So, my name is Eric Gumnowski. I'm one of the co-founders and the chief business officer, or CBO, with Ermetic. Ermetic is an identity-first cloud infrastructure security platform, helping customers all the way from Fortune 10 enterprises to cloud-first unicorns that had never any single server on-prem protect their public cloud infrastructure environments. Now, what we're going to focus today is a little bit about why identity is so centric to your AWS or in general public cloud infrastructure security. So, does anybody here can or knows or have any idea what's the biggest difference from a security perspective between your on-premise infrastructure and your public cloud infrastructure? What happens once you take a server or an environment and you take it out of your on-premise data center, out of your private cloud, and you put it into the public cloud? Any ideas? Okay, let me help you with that. The biggest difference between on-prem infrastructure and cloud infrastructure is the nature of the control plane and the perimeter. On-premise network is king. That's your major perimeter. That's why when you would go to security conferences, until a few years ago, you would see tons and tons and tons of network security vendors. Today, all these network security vendors are moving to the cloud and doing cloud security. Now, why that? Because when you look at AWS and the 300 AWS services that they offer us today to modernize our applications, only a handful of those services can actually be protected by network security components. Because to be protected by network security component, you got to have what? An IP address. If you don't have an IP address, there is no networking. And we have only a handful of services that can actually have an IP address. So servers and everything that runs on servers like databases. But once you start really modernizing your applications and utilizing the best and brightest of what vendors like AWS have to offer the modern enterprise, you start using platform as a service and managed applications and managed databases. And all of this just cannot be protected by network security. All of this in the cloud is controlled via the identity plane. So ultimately, identities, permissions, and the activities of those identities is what matter most in the cloud. Identity really becomes the major control plane and the biggest attack surface. This is what all the threat actors are doing. They're compromising identities, and they're just utilizing their native permissions to compromise and access sensitive resources. That's why the vast majority of security failures, and this is not us saying, this is other thought leaders in the space, like Gartner, is saying, the vast majority of security failures result from identities and permissions and entitlements mismanagement in the cloud. And this is the problem that we in Ermetic help our customers solve. Now, identity is not the only problem, and you cannot look at an identity in a silo. You have to look at identity as part of your broader control plane, as part of your broader configuration story, and that's why in Ermetic, what we are offering our customers is a combination of a traditional first-generation cloud security capability, what we all know today as CSPM, that looks basically at your inventory and configurations in the cloud in general, and mostly resource configurations. And we bundle that with our deep inspection of identities, permissions, and activities, what is known today in the industry as CIM or CIM, which stands for Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management category. And the bundling and the marriage of those CSPM and CIM capabilities is what allows us to bring our customers the Cloud Security 2.0, which really allows our customers to do everything starting from inventory management through proactive risk prevention across the stack, looking at network servers, but first and foremost, identities and data configurations, detection and response, because again, you can prevent as much as you like, but you have to always be able to assume breach. A threat actor, a determined threat actor, will always find a way to get into your environment, so it's not enough to prevent the breach or minimize the potential blast radius of a compromise, but you also have to assume breach and work to be able to detect and respond quickly to emerging threats within your infrastructure. And ultimately, all that has to tie into remediation, blast radius minimization, and compliance in your organization. So let's quickly stop talking and start looking at the actual technology. So as my chief revenue officer likes to say, welcome to the Ermetic platform. Basically, Ermetic is a SaaS solution that really integrates natively into your cloud service providers via their APIs and into your cloud-based identity providers via their APIs. There is no need to deploy anything, no VM, no agent in the environment. It's a fully agentless environment. You can onboard as many accounts as you like. We're kind of filtering on a specific part of the organization here. And once we connect it to your environment, we start collecting information. One type of information we're collecting from your environment are the resource configuration information, the identity configuration information, and the other type of information we're collecting are all the activities and all the API calls that really happen in your environment. By marrying these two informations together, we are able to provide you all the great value that we discussed before, starting all the way from inventory management through security to compliance. So let's start looking at the inventory management. So first of all, we give you full visibility into all your cloud-based resources and identities, right? So you can look at all your identity resources across various cloud service providers, right? So you can see all the resources. You can see all the identities that are managed within those environments. You can see all the network resources. You can see all your compute resources. If you like to dig deeper and you say, hey, I know I have those 46 EC2 instances here, and I want to learn more about my virtual machines running in my AWS environment, you can zoom in. You can get a full description of all the resources you have in the environment. And it's not only the plain text information that we're able to present you here. We actually collect the configuration information. We process that information on the back end, and we are presenting you already the actionable processed information. So with Ermetic, you can easily say, hey, I want to look at those EC2 instances in my environment that are actually exposed to the internet, for example, those that are exposed directly or those that are exposed indirectly, meaning they don't have a public IP address, but there is still internet traffic that can go to that machine via a load balancer that would take an ingress traffic and push that towards that machine. So for example, you can zoom in only on those 27 EC2 instances, and then you can say, out of those, I want really to look at those EC2 instances that actually run with high privileges in my environment. To do that, you have to look at the EC2 instance. You have to analyze the identity, the service account, the IAM role in AWS lingo that it can use in the environment. You have to understand the effective permissions of that IAM role, what it actually can do in my environment, taking into account all the various ways permissions can be granted or denied in environments like AWS, which is extremely complex because you have to marry identity-based resources, resource-based policies, service control policies, boundaries, allows, denies, and so on and so forth, conditions, of course. We do all that processing on the back end, and we are able to tell you with one click, show me all the privileged resources you have in my environment, and you get a list of a number of machines that you can export. You can share that with various stakeholders in the organization, and you can do whatever analytics you want on that. If you dig in deeper into a specific resource, you can, of course, see all the configuration of that resource. You can understand how this resource is exposed to the internet. So we can actually visualize for you the networking exposure. You can also ask questions here like, show me everything that is accessible, for example, from the entire internet, and you're automatically getting a representation of that. And ultimately, you can actually see the permissions that this machine can access in the environment. You can always zoom in. You can see different resources. You can correlate that to the actual activity log of all the actions that the machine is doing in the environment. You can analyze that log yourself. You can do investigation, forensics. For example, you can easily ask questions like, show me all the actions that my machine has done from a specific IP address, or all the action that happened, for example, in the past couple of days. You can zoom on these activities, export them. We run our own advanced anomaly detection algorithms on that. That talks to the detection capabilities and the response capabilities we were talking about. But ultimately, we also correlate between those permissions that are actually present, the action that this machine can actually do, to what it actually does, which allows us to help you and automatically zoom in on all the activities that this machine is actually doing, right? So it's very easy to understand the potential blast radius of the attack, the actual blast radius, and also minimize excessive permissions and achieve least privilege and zero trust. Now, with all that great information, we're not only showing you that, but we're actually allowing you to enforce a broad range of security policies on your environment, looking at compute policies, data policies, IAM policies, anomaly detection policies, and also giving you the ability to create your own customizable rules and policies that you can force on your environment, both from the identity perspective, networking perspective, resource management perspective, really giving you full stack security, visibility, policy enforcement, and detection and response capabilities. Now, every time we have a resource or an identity in the environment that performs something that is not aligned to one of those security policies, we will, of course, create a finding for you, right? And you can see, of course, all the findings in the environment. You can always group them by finding type, for example. You can filter on specific findings. So, for example, you can say, hey, I want to see all the findings that relate to publicly exposed compute resources. And immediately you will see all the findings that relate to identities that are linked to compute resources that are exposed to the internet, just like the example we saw before, right? Why is this interesting? Because a publicly exposed compute resource can be potentially compromised by an external threat actor. Those resources are constantly scanned automatically. Once you put a machine in the internet, it's being constantly scanned by a variety of threat actors. Sometimes those vulnerabilities are exploited automatically, and ultimately, if this compute resource, this compromised compute resource, has sensitive permissions in the environment, eventually the threat actor can pivot and get directly access to all your sensitive data and sensitive resources. So this is an example, and by the way, you can see that all the findings are always prioritized by the level of risk. We take all the broad context into the story. You can always dive deeper into each and every one of those findings. So for example, here you can see a finding that talks about an identity that is linked to a public compute that has sensitive permissions. You can see the permission graph. You can see the potential blast radius of that compromise event. And you can always zoom in deeper. So for example, you want to say, hey, I want to see all the critical permissions that this identity has, all the privilege escalation paths to an admin. And immediately you can see that our identity or service one IAM roles that are used by a variety of compute resources, a Lambda function, and an EC2 instance that is exposed to the internet has a bunch of policies. And sometimes in combination of different policies, it can drive privilege escalation path to other resources in the environment. So for example, this service one role can self-elevate to admin and get to an admin on this specific account, on the development account. But you can see that it can also, by easily applying the cross-account filter, you can see that our identity can assume another role in a production account that runs with admin privileges, right? So with Ermetic, you can really hone in on all your potential privilege escalation path, whether these privilege escalations are performed via AWS configurations or via potential compute resources that can also be running with sensitive permissions. Because if I am able to take over an EC2 instance or a Lambda function in the environment, for example, we're talking about a Lambda function, right? And that Lambda function is running with admin privileges because it's an automation that is designed to do whatever work in your environment. And I have a sensitive permissions to that Lambda function. For example, if I can update the code of that Lambda function, push my own code to that function, clearly I can elevate my privileges to an admin because I can take over that function. And that because that function runs with sensitive permissions or admin privileges in the environment, I can do whatever I want in the environment, right? So Ermetic allows you to automatically identify all the privilege escalation paths in your environment, and of course, ultimately drives toward full remediation, one-click remediation, where basically we're looking at all the sensitive permissions that this identity has. We automatically understand which permissions are required, which permissions are excessive, and we allow you to enforce list privilege at scale across your environment. And in that way, minimize the potential blast radius of a potential compromise event, help you achieve list privilege, and help you achieve compliance. As I was saying, that all drives ultimately towards compliance. When we can tell you how well does your environment align to compliance standards and best practices, you can always dig deeper into any compliance standard. For example, SOC 2. You can look at the SOC 2 requirements. What we have done at Ermetic, we have leveraged our unique know-how into analyzing those compliance standards, tying those compliance standards back to the security build-in policy that we offer our customers, but also to the custom policy that you can put in place. And then we take requirements like list privilege, we tie them back to those necessary compliance standards, and a security policy that will allow you to enforce broadly across the environment. You can look at each and every policy. You can see all the resources that were evaluated against that policy. You can see which resources have failed. You can see the risk profile, and you can ultimately generate very user-friendly reports that you can share internally. You can share with your auditors. You can push it out to other compliance officers in your organization, and so on and so forth. Again, ultimately, we support a lot of built-in integrations at Ermetic that really allow you to push this information out to all the various stakeholders in your organization. We integrate with all the modern DevOps and development tools and platforms, Jira, ServiceNow, Slack, Splunk, and other partners in the ecosystem. We also allow you to push information out through webhooks or pull any information out from Ermetic via the Ermetic API. So you can pull all your cloud inventory, you can pull all the findings, all the resources, and act on that automatically in your environment. That's basically it. So just to summarize what we've seen today, we talked about the importance of the CIM, or identities in permissions, in your overall cloud infrastructure security stack. We talked about the fact that identities and permissions are effectively the new perimeter to your cloud infrastructure, and therefore they really become the biggest attack surface of your cloud infrastructure. And when you're thinking about your cloud infrastructure security roadmap, you should be thinking identity first, like Ermetic does, because once you nail the identity security as part of the broader security ecosystem, you can do everything from really security prevention across the stack. You can look at your identity intelligence. You can really manage your posture from the identity perspective. You can minimize blast radius by removing excessive permissions. You can detect any potentially publicly exposed resource and ultimately drive compliance in your organization. That's it. Thank you so much for being with us today and learning a little bit more about our identity-first approach to cloud infrastructure security. We're at booth 115, so please come meet our entire amazing team at booth 115. Thank you so much for being today with us.